The living room was heavy with silence that evening, the kind that felt suffocating, pressing on all of us. Thomas sat on the edge of the couch, staring at his hands. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. Grace and Daniel sat across from us, their heads bowed, their faces pale. And I stood there, somewhere between rage and heartbreak, struggling to make sense of it all. How could you let this happen? Thomas's voice, low and trembling, broke the silence. He wasn't asking anyone in particular, but his eyes flickered toward Daniel, and I could see the fury barely contained behind them. Thomas, I said softly, trying to diffuse the tension, we need to handle this carefully. Yelling won't help. Carefully, he snapped, his head jerking toward me. Carefully? Evelyn, our son has disgraced us. He's ruined his sister's life, and you're talking about handling it carefully? Daniel flinched at his father's words. I saw his fists clench in his lap, his face burning with shame. Grace let out a quiet sob, burying her face in her hands. We need answers, not blame, I said firmly. Answers? His voice rose. What answers do you want? Isn't it obvious what happened? He betrayed us, Eve. His own family. I'm sorry, Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. Sorry? Thomas barked, his voice like a whip. I'm afraid, young man, your sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done. That's enough, T. I yelled, my voice echoing in the room. He's still our son, Thomas. And Grace is our daughter. We're supposed to help them, not tear them down. Thomas stood, his face a mask of frustration and despair. Help them? I don't even know where to start, he said, pacing the room. How do you help this? His words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of his helplessness. I didn't have the answers either. My eyes drifted to Grace, who sat trembling in her chair, her tears flowing silently. And Daniel, who looked like a shadow of himself, crushed under the weight of his father's disappointment. Later that night, while Thomas buried himself in his home office, I found myself drawn to Grace's room. The walls were painted a soft lavender, a color she'd chosen when she was 10, and her bed was neatly made, as it always was. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking as I reached for the drawer of her nightstand. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed answers. I needed to understand what had gone wrong. Inside, beneath a few books and pens, I found it, her diary. I hesitated, my heart pounding. This was a violation of her privacy, but I was desperate. Taking a deep breath, I opened it. The first few pages were innocent enough. Entries about school, her friends, her favorite books. But as I flipped further, the tone changed. I don't know why I feel this way, one entry began. Daniel is my brother, but sometimes I feel like he's more than that. It's wrong, I know it's wrong, but I can't stop these feelings. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hands trembled as I read on. Daniel said he could kiss me because he loves me. Uncle Giddy said it's okay. But I don't think so. A wave of nausea washed over me as the pieces began to fall into place. The questions, the whispers, the distance, all of it started here. I closed the diary and sat there, numb. The guilt was overwhelming. How had I missed this? How had I failed to protect them? The next morning, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I called Grace and Daniel into the living room, clutching the diary in my hands. What's this? I asked, holding it up. Grace's eyes widened, her face going pale. Mom, you went through my stuff? I had to, I said, my voice trembling. I needed to understand what's been going on. Grace, Daniel, this has gone too far. You need to tell us everything. Grace looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. Daniel avoided my gaze, his shoulders hunched. Start talking, I said firmly. The silence in the living room was deafening. Grace and Daniel sat side by side on the couch, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on the floor. Thomas stood by the window, arms crossed, while I sat across from them, clutching Grace's diary tightly in my lap. My heart ached, but I knew we had to confront this head-on. "Grace, Daniel," I began softly, trying to steady my voice. "We're not here to punish you. We just want the truth. Whatever happened, we need to know so we can help you." Thomas let out a sharp breath, but didn't speak. His jaw was tight, his face unreadable. Grace sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "We didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. "We know," I said gently. "But you have to help us understand. Start from the beginning. When did this start? What made you feel this way?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I don't know," he mumbled. "It just happened." "It didn't just happen," Thomas interjected, his voice cold. "Where did you learn this? Who showed you? What did you see?" Daniel flinched, and I shot Thomas a warning look. "Thomas," I said firmly, "we promise not to yell." Thomas sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Fine. But they need to answer." I turned back to the children. "Did someone teach you this?" I asked. "Or show you something? You're still kids. You couldn't have come up with this on your own." Grace hesitated, glancing at Daniel. Uncle Giddy," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas froze. I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean, Grace?" I pressed, my voice trembling. She took a shaky breath. "He kissed me once. On my lip. But it felt weird. I didn't think much of it at the time, but..." "But what?" I asked. Daniel answered for her. "He said he loved her," he said with a tight voice. "He said it's okay to kiss people we love. But you didn't kiss me that way. I thought I should. I don't know." He trailed off, his face flushing red. "Did Uncle Giddy do anything else?" Thomas demanded, his voice low and controlled. Grace shook her head quickly. "No. He didn't touch me or anything. He joked a lot. And he called me his princess. And sometimes he'd hug me for a long time." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "What about Miriam?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Did she ever say or do anything?" Daniel frowned, thinking. She didn't do anything. But sometimes she'd laugh at Uncle Giddy's jokes even when they were weird. "Weird how?" Thomas asked. "Like, about love and kissing," Grace murmured. She'd laugh and say, "Giddy, you're too much," and then they'd just move on. I pressed my hands together, trying to piece everything together. "What about after Uncle Giddy left?" I asked. "Did anything else happen? Did anyone else say something or show you something?" Daniel hesitated, his fists clenching in his lap. "At school," he said, finally. "Some of the boys showed me stuff. Videos on their phones. I didn't want to watch, but you did," Thomas finished for him, his voice flat. Daniel nodded, his face burning with shame. Grace glanced at me nervously. "I saw things too," she admitted. "On the internet. I didn't mean to. It just popped up." "And you didn't think to tell us?" I asked, my voice cracking. "We didn't know how," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "It was embarrassing. And then we started talking about it. Just wondering what it would be like. And then she broke down, unable to continue." Daniel put an arm around her, his face filled with guilt. "We didn't know it was wrong," he said. We didn't think it would turn into this. Thomas turned away, his hands trembling. So you saw things online. You heard things at school. And you didn't think to come to us? You were always busy. At work, at the boutique. You never had time for us. Daniel shot back, his voice trembling. That's not fair, I said, my heart breaking at his words. We worked hard to give you the best life we could. But you weren't there, Daniel said, his voice cracking. When Uncle Giddy was weird, when Miriam laughed at things she shouldn't have, when the kids at school showed us things we didn't understand, you weren't there. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. We're here now, I said. And we're trying to fix this. But we need to know everything. Why your sister, Daniel? Why Grace? Daniel shook his head, his face crumpling. I don't know, he said. It felt easy. Like I didn't think it was bad to kiss my sister as I love her. Grace buried her face in her hands. I thought it meant he cared about me, she sobbed. I thought it meant he loved me. Thomas turned back to them, his face a mixture of anger and pain. Do you understand what you've done? He asked, his voice trembling. We do, Daniel said, his voice firm despite the tears streaming down his face. We're sorry. We didn't mean to hurt anyone. Grace nodded. We'll stop. We'll do better. We promise. For a moment, none of us spoke. The weight of their words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Thomas's eyes were red. I couldn't hide my tears. We'll hold you to that, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas turned and walked out of the room without another word. I stayed, watching my children, my heart breaking for them and for the family we had once been. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. They had told us so much, but it didn't feel like everything. And I was right. The silence at the dinner table that night was unbearable. Thomas stared blankly at his plate, poking at the food with his fork. Grace and Daniel sat across from him, their eyes fixed on their laps. I tried to fill the void with small talk about work and church, but no one responded. The family had become a shadow of itself, held together by fragile threads of pretense. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Thomas finally broke the silence. We can't let anyone know about this, he said, his voice low but firm. I hope you haven't mentioned this to anyone yet. Not the church, not the neighbors, not our closest friends, not even our family members. This family can't survive that kind of disgrace. I nodded slowly, even as guilt churned in my stomach. What do we do, Thomas? How do we move forward from here? He sighed, leaning back in his chair. We get rid of the pregnancy. That's the only way. My heart sank. The thought of terminating Grace's pregnancy felt like a knife twisting in my chest, but I knew Thomas was right. The alternative was unthinkable. We'll do it quietly, he continued. I know someone who can help. No one has to know. I nodded again, my hands trembling. Okay. But Grace, she's so young, Thomas. Is it safe? He's a professional. I'll make sure he handles this carefully. Thomas responded. This will break her, I whispered. It's already broken all of us, he replied coldly. The following week was a blur. Thomas made the arrangements. It was in a small city outside Port Harcourt. I stayed close to Grace, trying to prepare her for what was to come. She didn't say much, but her eyes were always filled with tears, and her hands shook whenever I touched her. The day of the procedure, we told the children we were going on a family trip to visit a doctor. Daniel was exempted though, he had practicals to do in school, none the wiser about what was happening. Grace sat quietly in the car, her face pale. I reached over and squeezed her hand, but she didn't squeeze back. The clinic was discreet, just as Thomas had promised. The staff didn't ask questions, and neither did we. The procedure was over in a few hours, and we left with a heavy silence hanging over us. That night, Grace didn't come out of her room. I sat outside her door, listening to her muffled sobs, feeling like the worst mother in the world. In the days that followed, we did our best to pretend everything was normal. Grace stayed home from school for a few days, claiming she wasn't feeling well. Daniel noticed her distance, but didn't press for details. Thomas threw himself into work, staying late at the office and avoiding conversations about the family. I focused on the boutique, using the distraction to keep myself from falling apart. At church, we smiled and greeted everyone as usual, hiding the truth behind polished facades. "How's Grace?" a friend asked me one Sunday. "She hasn't been looking well lately." "Oh, she's fine," I replied with a forced smile. "Just a little under the weather. She'll be back to herself in no time." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but it was necessary. No one could know the truth. One of our nosiest neighbors, Sister Margaret, approached me after service, her eyes sharp and probing. "I saw someone like you leaving a clinic in Elim last week," she said casually. "Everything all right?" My blood ran cold, but I forced a smile. "Oh, yes. A relative of mine was admitted there," I said quickly. "But they have been discharged now." Sister Margaret nodded, but her knowing look sent shivers down my spine. For a while, it seemed like we had successfully buried the secret. Grace returned to school, her face carefully blank but otherwise normal. Daniel resumed his routines, tinkering with his gadgets and staying up late studying. Thomas and I avoided talking about what had happened, pretending everything was fine. But the cracks were still there, barely hidden beneath the surface. At first, we clung to the illusion of normalcy, both of us desperate to believe that time would heal the wounds. Thomas spent more hours at the bank, coming home later and later, his tie askew, his face drawn with exhaustion. I knew he wasn't just tired from work, he was avoiding me, avoiding us. At night, we lay in bed with our backs to each other, the silence between us louder than any argument we'd ever had. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him how scared I was, how guilty I felt. But the words caught in my throat. Every time I tried, I remembered the cold anger in his voice when he looked at Daniel and called him a disgrace. I wasn't sure if I'd be met with comfort or more blame. One evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, Thomas came in, loosening his tie. I glanced up, hopeful for a moment, but his expression was distant. "How was work?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Busy," he replied curtly, heading to the bathroom without another word. I bit my lip, my chest tightening. The air between us was so thick it felt like I was suffocating. It came to a head one weekend when Thomas finally spent the day at home. We were in the kitchen, Grace and Daniel upstairs. I was chopping vegetables for dinner, and he was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. "I think we need to talk to someone," I said carefully, not looking up from the cutting board. "Someone like who?" he asked, his tone clipped. "A counselor," I said, hesitating. "A family therapist. The kids need help processing everything, and so do we. We can't keep pretending this didn't happen." Thomas set his phone down with a sharp click. "Therapists don't fix these kinds of problems, Evelyn," he said, his voice low. "They only dig up more dirt." "That's not true," I argued, turning to face him. "We need help, Thomas. This isn't something we can handle on our own. Can't you see that?" His jaw tightened. "What I see is a family that's barely hanging on. Do you really think dragging some stranger into this will help? Do you want everyone to know what happened?" I threw down the knife, my frustration boiling over. "This isn't about what people will think. It's about our children. They're broken, Thomas, and we're not doing anything to fix it." "They're not the only ones who are broken," he shot back, his voice rising. Do you think I wanted any of this? Do you think I don't feel like a failure every single day? I can barely look at Daniel without, he stopped himself, shaking his head. Without what? I pressed, my heart pounding. Without remembering how badly we failed as parents, he said quietly. His words hit me like a blow. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling. You think this is my fault, I said, my voice breaking. I didn't say that, he replied, avoiding my gaze. You didn't have to, I whispered. We sat there in silence, the distance between us feeling like an insurmountable canyon. From that day on, something shifted. We still shared the same house, the same bed, the same routine. But we were strangers to each other. Thomas buried himself in his work, using long hours and endless meetings as an excuse to avoid being at home. When he was home, he was distant, speaking to me only when necessary and often with an edge of irritation. I threw myself into running the boutique, using the chaos of inventory, sales, and customers as a distraction. But every time I walked through the door at the end of the day, I felt the weight of everything we weren't saying pressing down on me. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, I heard Thomas come in. I waited, hoping he might sit beside me, that we might talk. But he walked straight past, heading upstairs without a word. I stared at the empty seat beside me, tears pricking my eyes. How had we become this? A family shattered into pieces, with no way to put ourselves back together. Despite everything, we managed to maintain a united front in front of the children. We smiled when necessary, asked about their schoolwork, and pretended everything was fine. But the truth was, we were barely holding on. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Thomas cleared his throat. Grace, Daniel, he said, his voice steady but cold, your mother and I have been talking. From now on, there are going to be stricter rules in this house. No more phones without supervision. No more staying up late. And you will both focus on school. Do you understand? Yes, Dad, they said in unison, their voices subdued. I glanced at Thomas, silently thankful for his attempt at control, even if it felt too little, too late. For a moment, I thought things might get better. But then I saw the way Grace looked at Daniel when she thought no one was watching. And the way he seemed to always hover near her, like an invisible thread still bound them together. The cracks were still there, growing wider by the day. And I didn't know how to stop them. One evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard laughter from the living room. It was Grace and Daniel, sitting on the couch, watching a comedy show. They seemed happy, relaxed. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we really could start over. But then I started noticing things, small, almost insignificant moments that made my stomach twist. Grace would linger in Daniel's room longer than necessary, under the pretense of him helping her with her homework. Daniel would laugh at her jokes in a way that felt different. And sometimes, when they thought no one was watching, they would exchange a glance that I couldn't quite understand. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between them. You're the only one who gets me, Grace said softly. Same here, Daniel replied. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't what they said, it was how they said it. There was an intimacy there, a closeness that felt too strong, too deliberate. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. They were siblings, after all. This was just their way of repairing their bond after everything that had happened. They were not that stupid to let the mistake repeat itself. That Saturday, Thomas suggested we have a family dinner to reconnect. We sat around the table, sharing stories and laughing for the first time in months. Pass the salt, Daniel, Grace said, smiling. Get it yourself, he teased, but there was a softness in his tone. They laughed, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe things really were going back to normal. But later that night, as I passed Grace's room on my way to bed, I heard muffled voices. I paused, pressing my ear to the door. You know I still love you, right? Daniel's voice said. I love you too, Grace replied softly. My breath caught in my throat. I pushed the door open without thinking, and the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. Just when Evelyn and Thomas thought they had buried the secret and could finally start afresh, life had other plans. The cracks they tried so hard to conceal were far from healed, and the storm they feared was only beginning. As Grace and Daniel's forbidden bond continues to unravel, the family teeters on the edge of complete collapse. What happens when their darkest fears come to life once again? And how far will the parents go to protect what's left of their shattered reputation? Part 3 will bring the most heart-wrenching revelations yet, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. If you've been captivated by this emotional journey so far, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to watch the next part of this story. And don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. What would you do if you were in Evelyn's shoes? Stay tuned, because the story is far from over.